You are not living your life. You are repeating a script written by a part of yourself that you don't even recognize. And the worst part? That part was never your enemy, until you decided to ignore it. Carl Jung called it the shadow. I call it an invisible prison. And I know that right now it's working on you. It was the shadow that chose that person you knew would hurt you. It was the shadow that made you accept less than you deserved. It was the shadow that pushed you into decisions you justified with, "I had no choice," but which deep down were just repetitions of old fears. The shadow doesn't come screaming. It whispers. And when you realize it, you're already obeying it. It disguises itself as prudence to keep you paralyzed. It wears the mask of kindness to prevent you from setting boundaries. It presents itself as humility to hide its fear of being seen. And you believe it, because it's easier to blame the world than to face the truth. What holds you back is not outside. It's inside. I spent years running from my shadow. I built masks so convincing that even I believed them. I sold myself as someone strong, but I was just someone trained not to feel. I presented myself as independent, but I was just afraid of needing someone. And while I hid, the same cycles repeated themselves. Approach, surrender, disappointment, closure. It was as if life were a circular corridor, where every door led me back to the beginning. Jung said, "What you deny subjugates you." I denied it for years, and paid the price. I lost relationships, opportunities, and, above all, time. Because every time you run away from a part of yourself, you build the path to finding it again. Life is persistent. It will put the same tests, the same faces, the same pains in front of you until you look at what you are trying to avoid. And I know that looking is scary. It's like going down into a dark basement where all the versions of yourself that you would rather forget are stored. The frightened child, the rejected teenager, the adult who failed. But what no one tells you is that inside, along with the painful memories, are the weapons you need most. Your courage, your authenticity, your ability to set boundaries. That's when I understood that everything changed. I realized that integrating the shadow is not about becoming friends with it, nor justifying mistakes with, "That's just how I am." It is bringing light to what has always lived in darkness. It is stopping emotions on autopilot from driving your life. It is looking at fear and asking, "What do you want to teach me?" It is facing anger and understanding, "You are here to protect me from what?" It is accepting sadness and saying, "I hear what you want to show me." This journey isn't pretty at first. It's ugly, uncomfortable, and often lonely. Because when you start choosing yourself, some people will leave, some doors will close. But the ones that stay and the ones that open later will be real. And you'll realize that you haven't lost anything. You've just gotten rid of what required your emotional death to exist. Today, I can say that I am not free because I eliminated the shadow, but because I learned to walk with it. When it appears, I don't rush to chase it away. I listen. And in listening, I find what I need to continue. That's the difference between living stuck in an old script and starting to write your own. And if you want to find out how to do that, stay with me, because what comes next is not cheap motivation. It is a psychological map to break cycles, integrate your parts, and take ownership of the life that has always been yours, but that your shadow did not want you to see. I learned the hard way that what destroys me doesn't come from outside, it comes from within. Silent, patient, precise. It's called the shadow. I treated it as an enemy for years, and that's how it won every battle. When I pretended it didn't exist, it chose for me. When I smiled to keep up appearances, it took note of every concession and charged me interest in the silence of the early morning. It was Jung who gave me the map I didn't want. What you deny subjugates you. I denied it, and I was subjugated. The shadow does not appear as a monster. It disguises itself as virtue. I prided myself on being controlled, but it was fear of confrontation. I sold myself as generous, but it was an addiction to approval. I said I don't care, but it was anesthesia. That's why the same plots kept coming back. I attracted people who demanded what I didn't know how to deny, Jobs that reinforced my value only when I emptied myself. Relationships where love was synonymous with silence. It wasn't bad luck. It was programming. My unconscious pressed the buttons. I called it destiny. The first shock was admitting that negative emotions were facts, not flaws. Anger showed me the limits I didn't set. Envy pointed to skills I was afraid to develop. Guilt meant I was paying a debt no one had charged me. I started listening without obeying. I stopped asking for the feelings to go away and started asking, "What are you trying to teach me?" When the answer came, it hurt like an old truth, one that had always been there, locked away, waiting for maturity to be spoken. I tested this on the battlefield that brought me down the most. Rejection. Before, a simple no was enough to make me implode and go back to chasing any crumb of validation. Now I practice taking a break. 3 breaths, looking directly at the wound, naming what it screams. It's almost always the same. Prove you deserve it. And I respond, I don't negotiate my worth. The feeling doesn't go away, but it loses control. I move on. The shadow, frustrated, learns that it doesn't rule me. It only informs me. Another minefield was perfectionism. I called it high standards. It was fear of being seen as incomplete. Whenever I postponed a project until it was ready, I was just postponing judgment. The antidote was ridiculously simple and brutal. Publish imperfect. 5 minutes of embarrassment saved me 5 years of suspended life. I discovered that the criticism I feared was the criticism I directed at myself. The world was merely echoing my verdict. And then came the part that scared me the most. Integration is not absolution. It is not saying this is who I am and using your shadow as an excuse to hurt others. Integration is bringing light, responsibility, and direction. If my anger protects, it protects without destroying. If my desire is ambitious, it is ambitious without betraying. If my fear alerts, it alerts without paralyzing. I wrote a code for myself, short, internal, non-negotiable. I don't abandon myself to fit in. I don't fake peace to avoid truth. I don't outsource my limits. This code doesn't make me good, it makes me whole. Today I see the cycles before they devour me. When the old urge to explain myself in order to be accepted arises, I choose to sustain myself. When the impulse to please in order not to lose appears, I choose to lose what requires my self-betrayal. When loneliness threatens with stories of worthlessness, I sit with it as if it were a messenger, not a verdict. And little by little, life changes tone. Not because it got easier, but because I stopped fighting against myself. The shadow is still with me, but now it walks beside me, not in my place. I grew up believing that what destroyed me were the people and situations that hurt me. The lies, the closed doors, the broken promises, the silences that screamed louder than any offense. But little by little I realized that none of this would have power over me if I didn't find an echo within myself. Jung was right when he said that what we don't face in ourselves, we will find as our destiny. The words that hurt me only hurt because they touch old wounds, opened long before the person who uttered them appeared in my life. Rejections only tear me down because they find a void that has never been filled. Failures only paralyze me because they awaken a fear of not being enough that has always been there. The world does not create my pain out of thin air. It only points to the places where I was already broken. And no matter how hard I tried to blame what was outside, it was impossible not to realize that each trigger was, in fact, a map. And each pain, a clue to what I had not yet faced. That's when I understood. The enemy isn't pain. It's the way I protected myself from it. Because poorly constructed protection becomes a prison. When I hide, when I numb myself, when I pretend I don't care, I'm not saving myself. I'm distancing myself from the only real chance of healing. What I believed to be armor was just a barrier that kept me away from my own truth. I looked at people who had experienced losses that would have destroyed me, and yet they were still standing. Not intact, but alive. I asked myself, what do they have that I don't? The answer came like a punch. Awareness. They knew where the pain came from, so it didn't surprise them. They knew their shadows, so they didn't rule their actions. I, on the other hand, spent my life trying to control what others thought, said, and did, trying to be good enough not to be abandoned, strong enough not to be hurt, smart enough not to be deceived. But control is an illusion, and living trapped in that illusion is living in constant tension, like someone trying to hold back a dam with their hands. Sooner or later, the water always wins. The truth is brutal. Freedom does not come from shielding your heart. It comes from looking at everything that lives in it, what you love and what you fear, and stopping separating one thing from the other. The lines I drew to decide which parts of me were acceptable and which should be hidden were the same ones that kept me divided, weakened. When you embrace your own shadows, nothing on the outside can use them against you. Integration is not about becoming friends with your darkest side, nor is it about justifying mistakes with, "That's just how I am." It is about shining light where there was once silence. It is about deciding that neither anger, fear, nor desire will drive your life on autopilot. They may be in the car, but they are not holding the steering wheel. And that's where the real transformation begins. Not when you stop feeling, but when you start feeling with awareness. When you understand that every discomfort is a sign and that running away from it is missing out on a chance to learn. Because if you don't learn, the world will repeat the lesson until you look, and each repetition will be louder, more intense, more impossible to ignore. It took me a while to accept this, but on the day I did, I realized that pain was not my enemy. It had always been my most faithful teacher. When I started to see pain as a teacher, I realized that the shadow was not just a collection of wounds. It also held resources I had never used. The problem was that I was so busy trying to be the acceptable version of myself that I never stopped to explore the real version. Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. At first, this phrase seemed like an invitation to pessimism. Today I understand that it is the opposite. It is not about sinking into the worst, but about having the courage to go down there to rescue what has been left behind. Because everything I rejected in myself did not disappear. It was waiting. I remember the exact moment when I realized this. I was in the middle of an argument, about to back down as I always did to avoid conflict. But this time, something inside me rose up. A force that I would normally call anger took shape, and instead of destroying me, it protected me. Not to hurt the other person, but to prevent me from betraying myself. That's when I understood. My shadow was not only pain, it was also power. But to access that power, I had to let go of the controlled image I had of myself. And that was like breaking a mirror I had spent years polishing. Because in doing so, I had to face reflections I didn't want to see. My fear of rejection, my obsession with wanting to be needed in order to deserve love, my compulsion to please others to the point of losing my identity. The shadow showed me that each of these behaviors was actually a defense mechanism I had created when I was little. A child who learned that in order to survive, he had to predict other people's moods, that he had to erase himself so as not to bother anyone, that he had to deserve everything, even the right to exist. But I am no longer that child, and if I continued to obey her rules, I would be condemning my adult life to emotional imprisonment. So, little by little, I began to break old pacts. I stopped saying yes when I meant no. I stopped softening my opinion so as not to be misunderstood. I stopped explaining myself to justify choices that were mine. It was painful because every change felt like a threat to the identity I had carried for so long. But as the fear subsided, the feeling of freedom grew, and I realized that the strength I had been seeking had always been here, hidden behind traumas I didn't want to touch. Jung said that you cannot achieve wholeness by denying half of yourself. Today, I know that this means dancing with your shadow until it gets tired of fighting you. And in the process, I discovered something that changes everything. The shadow doesn't disappear, but it loses the power to drive your life when you recognize it. Now, when it appears, whether as fear, anger, or insecurity, I don't rush to chase it away. I listen to it. I ask what it is trying to show me. And almost always, it points to a place where there is still something to be healed or protected. That is the difference between living defensively and living awake. Defensive, every threat seems like the end. Awake, every threat is a warning, an opportunity to adjust course before the shipwreck happens. Integrating my shadow made me realize something I had never admitted. Often, it wasn't the world that sabotaged me. It was me. Not because I lacked ability, but because I was afraid of becoming who I could be. There is a certain comfort in remaining incomplete, because then you never have to deal with the full weight of your own strength. For a long time, I hid behind the excuse that things weren't for me, that certain dreams were for others, that certain victories required a type of person I wasn't. But the truth is, every time I said that, I was just avoiding the responsibility of transforming myself. Jung spoke about individuation as the process of becoming who you really are, not who the world expects you to be. It's a lonely path because it requires betraying other people's expectations. And sometimes it requires betraying even the image you've built for yourself. At first, it's a period of mourning. You say goodbye to who you believed yourself to be. But little by little, you realize that you're just coming home. I saw this process change the way I deal with relationships. Before, I molded myself to what others wanted, adjusted so as not to lose, diminished myself to fit in. And the result was always the same: resentment and exhaustion. Today, the shadow reminds me that if I have to disappear to keep someone, it's not love. It's a contract. And contracts that require my emotional death are no longer valid. At work, I've also changed. I spent years accepting less than I deserved, afraid that asking for more would be difficult. But I realized that the shadow held my ability to set boundaries, to negotiate, to say, "That's not enough." Fear told me that this would drive opportunities away. The truth is that it only drove away the wrong opportunities. The funny thing is that the more I accepted my shadow, the clearer it became that it was never a monster that needed to be destroyed. It was a guardian. It protected my courage, my authenticity, my ability to protect what matters. But in order to give me these weapons, it demanded something in return, that I stop lying to myself. Lying to yourself is the most sophisticated form of self-sabotage. It's saying everything's fine when you're drowning. It's making excuses for not moving forward. It's wearing a mask of strength while silently begging for permission to be weak. Today, when I realize I'm about to deceive myself, I stop, I breathe, and I ask, what am I trying to avoid feeling right now? Almost always, the answer is a very old fear of not being loved, of not being enough, of not being valuable. But now I know that facing that fear is the only way to get through it. And that's the irony. Everything I spent my life trying to avoid feeling is exactly what I needed to feel in order to be free. The shadow wasn't my prison. I was the jailer. And the key was always in my pocket. When I look back, I see that my whole life was shaped by internal battles I didn't even know I was fighting. With every decision, the shadow was there, not to destroy me, but to test whether I was ready to grow. The difference is that before, I ran from these tests. Today, I walk toward them. And I discovered that living this way isn't about beating the shadow, because it's not an enemy that can be defeated. It's about dancing with it until you learn the rhythm. It's about using what once paralyzed me as fuel. Anger, when recognized, becomes courage. Fear, when understood, becomes attention. Sadness, when embraced, becomes depth. This integration has given me something I had never experienced before: inner stability. No matter what happens outside, I know I won't abandon myself. And that's why the storms that once swept me away now only teach me how to navigate. But there is one detail that few people talk about. Living like this requires daily commitment. It is a silent pact not to hide from yourself. And that pact is not comfortable. It will hurt. It will destroy old illusions. It will leave you face to face with truths you have spent years avoiding. But it will also give you back to yourself. If you're listening to this now and feeling that my story is in some way your story, then you already know what you need to do. It's not about waiting to be ready. It's about starting while you're still afraid. Because if you wait for the fear to disappear, you'll wait forever. The shadow is not a mistake in your design. It's part of the drawing. And to ignore it is to live only half your life. You weren't born for that. And since you've come this far, I want to invite you to something. If this video has awakened something in you, like it now and subscribe to the channel. That's how you show me that this message is worth continuing. If you want to go further and contribute with any amount, know that it helps me keep this work alive and increasingly deeper. But I want more from you than just a click. I want commitment. So write a word in the comments that represents your decision to evolve. It can be integration, courage, or shadow. Choose the one that reminds you every day that transformation doesn't come from running away, but from facing up to things. This will be your mark, your public pact with your own evolution. Because in the end, what separates those who dream from those who change is simple: action.